Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by the Nemesis himself, Dr. Philip Chase. Hello, Philip.
Well, in fact, AP, I have indisputable proof that you are, in fact, the Nemesis, the nefarious Nemesis. And that proof is right here. Elbow patches. Only a dashing hero would have elbow patches, leaving the nefarious Nemesis position open for you.
Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty would disagree.
Okay, Sherlock.
Hang on a sec. Mic drop.
But I think that's a good segue because we are here to talk about character today. And one thing that you should not confuse is the protagonist versus the antagonist and hero versus villain, because sometimes you can have a villain who is the main character. So we'll talk about all that stuff, but we're going to talk about character, AP.
I hate you. Yeah. So there are a couple of terms really we should clear up first of all. So we have characterization
Yes.
are two main ones because character is the thing.
Right.
Characterization is how we develop a picture, a concept of what that thing is.
Right.
But character, and this is very, very common because we have specific terms. We operationalize terms when we're in any subject.
Yeah.
But I made a joke that one of the last times we were talking that just because you are a character doesn't mean that you have character, because character is also used to reflect sort of moral virtues. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about characters in fiction and how they are characterized, how we build this picture of them. But that is something that I think sometimes comes up. Terms, I hesitate to even spell out something as obvious as this, but terms can have multiple meanings depending on context.
Right. Right. Very true.
And that kind of semantic slipperiness can be very, very difficult particularly when we're having an informal conversation and someone is trying to be contrarian and they're insisting on a very literal definition of the term that is not appropriate to the operationalized definition of the term for the subject at hand. And we see a lot of this happening where, for instance, with prose. Well, prose is like prosaic and therefore mundane. You go, congratulations, you know how to read a dictionary. Do you also know literary history? Because prose, although it is the same word and etymologically linked, is coming from and has developed a different meaning in the context of literature. And insisting on going back to the dictionary and going back to etymological roots, that can be a fascinating way to understand the development and refinement of a term over time. That I'm not saying don't do that, but insisting on a literal definition for something that has been operationalized in context or in a subject, that very frequently derails our understanding. It'll lead us down this bizarre path as we are trying to fit a meaning that the word does not have in this context. And sometimes it can be revelatory. Other times we can end up in a hole in a cul-de-sac going, how did I end up here?
Yes. Well, that's very important to keep in mind. And there are a few, I don't know, we don't have an established order for all of these things we're going to cover today, but one thing I definitely did want to talk about in terms of how can we talk about characters? How can we analyze characters when we're, say, doing a review or doing a discussion? Some of the things that you can focus on, some of the terminology that you can throw out. So one of the things I wanted to talk about in terms of defining a character or analyzing rather a character in a story would be, I think of this as a spectrum, as flatness and roundness. And a flat character, often people say flat, and it seems to be a sort of derogatory connotation to flat, but actually flat characters are very, very important. And in fact, they are often conducive to symbolism in ways that round characters are not. But let's define flat and round here. What we mean And again, I want to emphasize it's not an either or situation. It's really more of a spectrum. But on the flat side, and I can see we're going to debate that one.
No, 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 no. It's just before we got to that, I thought we would be better off defining character.
Oh, well,
Before
that
we
might
actually
be
go
a
into
logical place to start. Yes. Okay. Logical. Okay.
well,
Let's define character. You go ahead and do that, and then we'll talk about flat versus round.
well, it's not so much a definition of character, but discussing what a character is within a text.
Yeah,
Because
that's a good place to start. Yeah.
character does not necessarily have to be a human. No, obviously, in a
Right.
realist text, quite often characters are human characters, but a
Mm-hmm.
cat
Mm-hmm.
can be a character within a text. So
Yep.
characters typically are entities, typically, not always. And we can get into a discussion of that. But characters are typically entities that perform actions or functions. And this is one of those weird things that can be difficult to wrap our heads around. Characters essentially are not real. They are functions of the narrative. And this seems very cold and mechanical. And quite often, when we hear authors speaking about characters, they don't speak about them this way because it is cold, mechanical, and almost like a scientific dissecting language for them.
Yeah.
But ultimately, characters are used as functions of the narrative. That's what they are there to illustrate things. They are there to do things, to further things, to explore things.
Right.
That is one of the difficulties we have because we like to think of particularly our favorite characters as real people, as people we might want to hang out with, or we enjoy reading their adventures.
Yeah.
But ultimately, when we scrape away all of that stuff, characters are functions within the narrative that typically perform actions. And
Yeah.
bearing that in the sort of the back of our mind, it doesn't have to be at the forefront, but understanding that character is part of the function of narrative, that it does have that mechanical nature behind it.
Yeah.
That can be very, very useful when it comes to understanding the role and placement of things happening. And it also explains sometimes why we feel, or we can feel, that characters lack agency. And we use this term a lot, but characters don't have agency.
Mm.
None, no character has agency because they are functions of the narrative. They are not real. They do not possess minds. They do not possess choice. What
Mm-hmm.
we typically mean by that, and well, I don't like speaking for everyone else, but one of the ways that we mean, this character didn't have agency is we feel that the plot or the narrative or the events are dictating what the character is doing rather than a sense of psychological realism and the character appearing to choose that action.
Right.
So it's when we frequently talk about they are acting out of character because they do something that was necessary for the story or the plot or the narrative to move forward, but it doesn't fit with our conception of how that character would act.
Right.
And that's when the mechanics of it become very, very visible. And authors typically disguise those mechanics.
Mm. Yeah, brilliant. And just to support the definition you just put forward about character, there are other elements of the story, like setting, for example, can sometimes even function as a character. We're going to talk about setting in the next video, but as a separate element of storytelling. But it is kind of fun to realize that, oh yeah, sometimes the setting functions in a way like a character, that it has an effect on the human characters in the story that feels almost active, and that's really fun, and there are lots of great examples of that in many stories. Jack London stories are often like that, where you have this character in the cold wilderness trying to survive, and it feels like nature itself is in opposition to the character, almost this vast, maybe indifferent, but maybe even hostile presence, right? That sort of thing.
And Esselmont's Blood and Bone evoked
Here you
much
go.
of the same thing because the
Yeah.
jungle setting there was so alive and you could see the different relationships that the humanoid characters had with this setting, and the setting became a character in and of itself.
Yeah, so I just like that definition because it leaves room to recognize, oh yeah, it doesn't have to be a human to be a character. It can be an animal. It can be, you know, the setting. It could be so many other things. So I really like that. So now I think we're ready to start talking about flat and round. And again, neither one is good or bad in and of itself. These are just descriptions. And again, it's a spectrum. It's not an either or situation in this case. So flat means one-dimensional, that there is a dominant aspect to this character that defines this character, that is this character. And that's why a flat character is often conducive to symbolism. You have many examples. We've talked about archetypes. We have a whole series of videos about archetypes. So one being the wise mentor figure, right? That's a flat character. That's Gandalf, Merlin, Dumbledore, you name it, or Obi-Wan Kenobi. You recognize this character. There are certain attributes that go with this character, but wisdom is a predominant thing there. An experienced character. Sometimes a beard helps. I don't know, but you know that character, and there's also a pattern behind that as well. There's a pattern that character fulfills within the narrative, which is that character is there to mentor the protagonist, usually to get the protagonist going on the adventure, to show the protagonist the way, and to show the protagonist, by the way, meaning main character, not necessarily the hero, right? But to have that function, and then eventually to get out of the way, often by dying, right? So that's a flat character. That's not a bad character. It can be very vivid. One of my favorite examples of an author who has fairly, again, it's a spectrum, but I would say more on the flat side more often than not, but very vivid, very interesting characters. It's Joe Abercrombie. I would argue that his characters often are more flat than round, certainly in the initial trilogy and in the standalone books. I think some of the characters in the later trilogy, Age of Madness, are probably a more round, but nevertheless, these are vivid, wonderful characters. I love those characters. And then round, if flat is one-dimensional, round is multi-dimensional. Character who feels that you could meet this person in real life, that they're a person you could have a conversation with and know. It feels that way anyway. And that they have, conflict within them, multiple aspects to their personality. A great example of that being Fitz from the Realm of the Elderlings. Feels like a very fleshed out character that you know intimately, especially because of that first person narration where we're in his head all the time. And we know his failings, his triumphs, his loves, his desires, his fears, just to completely realize one of the most realized characters you can find in fiction. So, yeah.
And what's interesting about this, and you alluded to it when you were discussing there, is that while we talk about flat characters and round characters, it's not either or.
Right.
And I think people are probably going to get annoyed each time when I go, these are opposite ends of a spectrum.
Right.
But there is movement between these, because we can have characters that are initially flat, that they are not particularly well developed. They aren't particularly deep. They are straightforward. But over time, they can deepen and become more complex, and they move toward round. And so again, if we think of characters that have an arc, I know some people say character arch.
Oh, no.
I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying that my blood pressure goes up, my eye starts to twitch, and I may suffer an embolism. But a character arc usually is about the development of character. Do all characters need an arc to be successful characters? No, because there are lots of different types of narrative where the character at the beginning is almost identical to the character at the end. The picaresque in particular is famous for this. The character does not grow, does not learn, does not change. It's a repeating cycle. In old style serials, Flash Gordon, where every week there was a different episode, or The Rocketeer and there was a different episode, the character doesn't evolve because each week, each episode, it had to be the same character at the beginning as it was going to be the same character at the end. this idea that characters must have an arc is a premise and an assumption about character that does not apply to all narratives. And this is why understanding the type of narrative that is in front of us can be really, really important, because different narratives operate with different tropes, different conventions, different expectations. They are appealing to different narrative patterning. And assuming that, oh, the only good character is X type, that doesn't fit necessarily with this other type of narrative. But knowing and understanding the different types of character, the different ways that these are explored, is an exceptionally useful thing to have, because we can recognize then when they are being used simply as functions, or when they're being used to evoke a sense of mimesis or a sense of authenticity by deepening and rounding and adding complexity to the character to make them appear more real. Understanding that is really, really useful. But saying that it must apply in all circumstances, that I think is where we have become overly reductive. Because one thing we didn't mention there is the difference between character and caricature.
Right, right, yes. Which has its place as well. You know, caricature is an extreme version of something that used often for mockery, sometimes to make a point. You know, there's a purpose behind caricature usually, right?
And Dickens, Charles Dickens, his work is full of caricature, these larger
Yes.
than life characters that embody concepts.
And
But
flat
they,
characters, they're flat. Dickens' characters are very flat, but vivid and larger than life, as you said. Yeah.
and so they move from being a representation of an identifiable character into an overt representation almost of concepts that have come
Exactly.
alive, and they embody that concept, and we can see it as a caricature.
Right.
And again, it's not a simple they are a character or they are a, because we have movement between these. It's not
Yeah.
a simple, it's not either side of a coin. It's
Yeah.
ways of describing the dyadic poles of how all of these things happen. And if you think, uh, even within, say, something like Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, Frodo, an exceptionally complex, well-rounded, deep character, flaws, introspections, strengths. We can identify who Frodo is. Barnum and Butterbur, the in Bree, at the end of Bree, caricature.
Dancing pony. Yeah.
Like that, he is a caricature because
Yeah.
he's not a particularly deep character. He's a one note, almost stereotypical, the slightly florid, enthusiastic, slightly overweight tavern owner who's he has brilliant characteristics. He's a very vivid presence in the text, but he's much closer to caricature, and he's much flatter than the development we have of Frodo. So to say that Tolkien used a caricature for Barliman is not denigrating Tolkien's work.
No.
It's thinking about how he used it, what purpose it was fulfilling. It's not saying, oh, well, Tolkien, we don't need to defend Tolkien from an accusation that he included caricatures. We don't need to defend Dickens. These things are in it. They serve a function, and that function is brilliantly realized. And because of that, you see the craft behind it, the meaning behind it, the intention behind it. And that's sometimes where I think, because of our preoccupation with what we assume good character work is, if it doesn't fit that, we assume it is bad character work. And we're looking at it outside of the function and role that the thing has within the text.
Right. Brilliant. Yes, totally agree. And Tolkien's a good example of an author where you can see within the same work, Lord of the Rings, characters that are more on the round side, I would argue, like the hobbits, and particularly Frodo.
Oh, well, Merry and Pippin are they're basically the same. Like,
oh, come on now, don't bash Merry and Pippin now. You're gonna get in trouble here.
oh no, I just they're all of us who love the Lord of the Rings so many times people go, but there's no difference between Merry and Pippin, and you're like, oh, you just don't understand.
Yeah, Merry's the wise hobbit. Pippin is a lovable goofball. I mean, that's
Jackson flattened them a lot in the
like
adaptation.
I'm Merry and you're Pippin, right? So, but there are characters in Lord of the Rings who are very flat, very archetypal, let's say. Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli. You brought up another thing I thought that was very important, and there's some terminology that I think is helpful for that as well. You mentioned change a character within a character arc, static versus dynamic. If you have a character that does not change through the course of a story, again, that's not a judgment. There's no value attached to this. There's a purpose for characters who are static. They do not change in the course of the story. Whereas characters who are dynamic undergo significant change in the course of the story, often from some sort of epiphany or revelation, right? So you'll have a moment in the story where you can point to and say, oh, that moment was transformative. That's when this character realized, oh, okay, that's the truth about this world that I'm in. And then that brought the character on a different trajectory, or made the character realize the truth about their past or whatever it might be. And that's, there's a pivotal moment in the story where you see that happen. For example, we'll give a fantasy example too, but James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues, great story. And there's a moment near the end of that where there are two brothers who are in the story. Sonny is the title character, but the narrator is his brother, his older brother, who's unnamed. We're getting his thoughts throughout. Both,
He's
by
a
the way,
teacher.
He's a teacher. That's right. And they're both round characters. And there's a moment near the end of the story where the narrator brother finally understands what has been motivating Sonny all this time, like where he's coming from, why he loves music, why he does what he does. And it's a point where he realizes his commonality with his brother. And it's a beautiful, beautiful story. Or another great example is Raymond Carver's Cathedral, where it was just a story where you have a narrator who is pretty unlikable, but it's shown something important about empathy in the course of the story through one of the other characters who happens to be a blind man. And suddenly that character realizes, has this beautiful moment of realization, of connection, and it's transformative. And you can see that's a big thing in fantasy, those transformative moments when a character suddenly kind of gets a sense of their destiny, that sort of thing. Arthur putting his hand on Excalibur and tugging it out of the stone, and boom, I don't know if that's necessarily an epiphany, but it's an important moment in his character journey, let's say.
Also, this is one of those things about Arthurian myth. There's the sword and the stone,
yeah,
and then there's the sword that the lady in the lake gives him. And
mm-hmm.
depending on
Pick your version. Yeah,
which version, Excalibur isn't both.
yeah.
Aneurysm time.
Uh-oh.
But one of the things that's fascinating about it, because even if we go back to classical Greek plays,
Yeah.
the arc described in a tragedy, so
Mm.
the narrative structure that we followed is actually very tightly tied to the position of the central character, the main character, the protagonist.
Yeah.
Because in a tragedy, typically they start at a certain position, things start going really, really well, they become elevated, and then something happens and there is a steep fall and decline, and they end up worse than they started.
Yeah.
That's the typical arc in a tragedy.
So
Othello.
Oedipus, for example, where literally in the moment when he sees what's really going on, gouges out his eyes because he doesn't want to see anymore. When he realizes, oh, I am married to my mommy and I did kill my daddy. Oops. Poke, 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 poke. Yeah.
He just loved his mother.
Yeah.
But in Othello, you have the same thing where Othello, he starts as a general, is granted the governorship of Cyprus. So we see this elevation, but then because of Iago's manipulations, He ends up dismissing Cassio, killing his wife. Then the manipulations become common knowledge, and he kills himself. This tragic end.
Right.
And the opposite happens in the traditional comedy, where typically they start in a position, and then things just start going wrong, and everything is horrible and terrible. And then there's a turning point, and suddenly everything works out in the end, and they end up in a position better than when they started.
Yeah.
And so the narrative structure is tied to the character arc.
Yeah. And in both cases, in the case of tragedy, where Oedipus has an epiphany, realizes the truth about his past, or where Othello realizes that he's been manipulated and that Desdemona was in fact not unfaithful, this is a moment of epiphany. And this is a moment where you see the character undergoing significant change. And then, of course, in the comedy, it also can be a moment of epiphany when the character realizes, oh, she does love me. Oh, okay, and then we go on the upward part of the trajectory, which leads us to the happy ending or the comedic ending, let's say, where everything turns out okay. So epiphany can play a great role in this, or a dynamic character, let's say, dynamism within a character, change within a character can be a really informative thing. And that also, we're going to talk about theme last in this series, but that's also a moment you can often point to. That epiphany is often going to be very relevant to a theme or the theme of the story. And that's usually that kind of pivotal moment is important, right? So these things are all connected to each other.
And isn't that astounding that a well-crafted narrative, that setting and character, and they all support one another.
Yeah.
They aren't separate things that exist in a vacuum. Although quite typically when we analyze, we break things apart. We focus on one thing because it makes it bite-sized. It makes it easier to manage to talk about one thing and then the next thing, rather than I got to talk about everything all at once. But this is something we always have to remind ourselves. Once we've broken it apart into these disparate elements, we have to remember that they all get put back together, that they are all linked, that they all bind together. Quite often, that the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. Or is it? No, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
That one, yeah.
That's what I meant. I haven't had enough coffee.
Yeah, I know.
And so when we talk about, you were talking about dynamic characters, like Flash Gordon, although he is very active and does a lot of things, he's an action character. His characteristics don't change. He doesn't really learn a lot. He doesn't evolve. And so he's actually quite a static character. But he is very active. And that's where we see, understanding how we are using the terms as a way to describe, not prescribe. We're not saying he must do these things. We're trying to describe what is actually happening, and understanding that a character can perform lots of actions, be heavily active, can be driving the text, driving the narrative, driving plot causality, and be a protagonist. They can be very, very active and proactive, but still be a relatively static character because their character is changing.
Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah. And so just to review some of the terms we've been going over, and it's good to separate these because a flat character is not necessarily the same as a static character. A round character is not necessarily dynamic. Round characters can be static. So don't confuse those. But also, when we're talking about the protagonist, main character, the character with whom we're most concerned as we are going through the story, whereas antagonist we haven't talked about yet, but that is essentially whatever opposes the protagonist. That can be a human character, but it can also be so many other things. It can be nature. It can be the world itself, as in a dying Earth story, like Book of the Ancestor by Mark Lawrence. The world itself is what's really the big antagonist that everybody is kind of working against. So those are good terms to keep in mind as well.
Okay, so if we discuss protagonist, main character, and hero for a sec,
Yes, because there's a
I
big difference there. Yeah.
well, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes it's all exactly the same character,
Sometimes. Yep. Yep.
but other times they're different. And the thing is, protagonist comes from, I believe it's the Greek, about the basically creating the action, moving the action.
Yeah.
And that's where the term protagonist comes from. Main character is who the center of the narrative is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not necessarily the same as the protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
Now, informally, when we're just chatting about things and you're not trying to think about it, you're just having a casual, informal chat with people. We frequently use protagonist, main character, and even hero interchangeably. And there's
Right.
no harm in that. But these terms actually do mean different things.
Yeah.
Main character. So if you have the story of Arthur, but it's being told by someone in his entourage, who's the main character? Who's the point of view always with? Who's the
Mm.
person who's going through all of these things? Arthur may be the protagonist, but
Mm-hmm.
we could have his knight or his bondsman being the main character,
Or Morgan Le Fay or something.
or
Yeah.
Morgan Le Fay, that they are the main character, not necessarily the protagonist. And when we talk about hero, again, we frequently conflate hero and main character, but a hero has heroic qualities.
Correct.
So if we're uh, engaged in a narrative in which the villain is a villainous character,
Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost. Right?
yeah. So Lucifer is not the hero of
No.
that story
No.
because hero is heroic, having these noble and heroic qualities. Lucifer is the main character
Yeah.
and arguably the protagonist.
Right.
Because, and then we can get into discussion about reactive or proactive characters.
Right. Yeah.
But it's just to kind of separate those out. Ordinarily, there's no major problem with using them interchangeably.
Right.
But realizing that if the story in the Star Wars universe, if someone wrote a story where Darth Vader is the central character, you wouldn't describe Darth Vader as the hero
Right.
because there are certain moral elements that are built into the term hero.
It's interesting though, because you can take, let's take the prequel trilogy, Phantom Menace and all that. He starts out as a hero, doesn't he?
That's Anakin. That's not Darth Vader.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Uh, but he becomes by the end clearly not the hero of this narrative, right? So
Oh, he was
it's
just misunderstood.
he was just not given the opportunities that he deserved by his mentor figure, right? So yeah, it's interesting how these things can be. And then of course you have, like Mark Lawrence's Broken Empire trilogy, where Jorg is not a hero, but he's definitely I think the protagonist and the main character of that trilogy.
And we would probably describe Yorga as an anti-hero.
Which brings up that term as well, anti-hero, which is useful. So what is an anti-hero, AP?
An anti an anti-hero is typically fulfilling the function of hero, but doing it in a way that is not necessarily morally virtuous.
Right, right.
So an anti-hero, someone who is quite often doing the right thing, but the methods that they employ are often very, let's say, dubious.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Another wrinkle would be a character like Don Quixote by Cervantes, right? He's in his head, he's the hero, but we see him differently, don't we?
and again, we typically use anti-hero to describe those darker, very flawed, often quite violent and dark, and in almost any circumstance you would consider evil but they
Right.
are working on behalf of a good cause, or uh, quite often justifying their behavior through a slightly facetious or thin utilitarian argument. And, oh yes, the means justify the ends,
The greater
or the
good.
ends justify the means.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you're right, anti-hero can be the deconstruction of hero as well, and it's again using the term in different senses,
Mm.
depending on the context of what you're talking about. A deconstruction of hero can quite often be an anti-hero.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but you then have villain, and villain, antagonist.
You
Do you
forgot
want me
nefarious.
to change the view type on this so that you disappear when I am talking, and I'll just mute you? I will mute you, young man.
That would be diabolical.
Which is why I wouldn't do it, because I'm the good one. So, antagonist
Yes.
is set up in opposition to the protagonist. So, if you think about it, antagonist and protagonist do not have moral virtues associated with them. They are
Correct.
solely about pushing the narrative in a particular direction. And if we think about it, the protagonist wants to go this way, the antagonist wants to go that way. And that
Exactly.
tension between them is typically where we find the tension of a novel, of a narrative, that people tend to think about it. Oh well, they're going that way, and they're thinking of it. They're coming into conflict. But
Mm.
if we think about it as a vector, as the antagonist wants to go that way and the protagonist that way, they're going in different directions. That drawing out creates a tension. That's the thing that we're looking at. It all depends on whether or not you can how you spatially visualize the relationship. But
Mm.
an antagonist acts in opposition to the protagonist.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned conflict. And I think that's a brilliant point, because sometimes you can even have, I suppose, a situation where you might come at it as analyzing the protagonist as having the antagonist within themselves. Even that could be the case sometimes. That conflict. In fact, there's that famous quote by William Faulkner, which is often misattributed to George R.R. Martin because Martin loves the quote, but there's nothing worth writing about, but the human heart in conflict with itself. And that's a great, I think, observation on the part of Faulkner, and one that is certainly taken to heart by George R. R. Martin in A Song of Ice and Fire. You look at pretty much any of the protagonists or characters that we're following along with in there, they all have this conflict somewhere or other, where whether it's Jon Snow, or should I be loyal to my family, or loyal to the wall where I'm supposed to be, and that sort of thing. You have that is in almost every single one of these characters that we're following along with, and that makes them interesting. Conflict is something that really brings, for whatever reason, Faulkner was right. Conflict within a character is interesting. It is something that we enjoy seeing play out within a story, and it drives the story, doesn't it?
And quite often, it's located in a tension between an external desire to do something and an internal desire to do something. Because the desire of a character, let's say a character has motivations, they want to become successful. And so doing that, there's a whole sequence of actions that can be attributed to that. But also they want to be seen as honorable. And so tension develops between the two different desires. Or we can look at it as an externally imposed action that they should be taking versus an internal desire for a different action.
Yeah.
And so understanding that, particularly with a lot of complex characters and rounded characters and deep characters, that they will have complex motivations, that they may have an internal desire as well as an external goal. And they don't necessarily have to match up. Frodo has the external goal of trying to destroy the ring, but he wants he and his friends to be happy and safe and not in danger and being hunted. And he's willing to act against his desire for safety in order to perform this action to save other people. And that's where we find the heroism. He's acting against his own self-interests in order to help other people. there's tension within those two different positions.
Yeah.
So there's a lot about understanding the internal character motivations and the uh, external things imposed upon them, or the goals, desires that are external to them, the
The
thing that they have.
quest, the quest,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. What else do we need to talk about in terms of character? I think we covered a lot already, actually, but were there any other terms or concepts that you wanted to bring up?
Um, can't think of any because it, I forgot to write things down.
And you haven't had your coffee either.
Well,
So.
I've been trying to sip it quickly as we've been talking. But in terms of character, I suppose one of the things I want to talk about is when people say I'm a character reader, I read for the characters.
Uh-huh.
And again, I am sure a lot of people are, but typically when we read a lot of fantasy, we aren't really character readers. Because if we were character readers, we'd be reading those character studies in a lot of literary fiction where very little happens. It's all about the in-depth exploration of character and the interiority of character and the human condition. That
Right.
is a character-focused narrative.
You're talking about cozy fantasy.
Well, in cozy fantasy, things still happen. We still want to find out what happens, and that would be plot-centric. But again,
Okay.
people tend to think about it as, well, I am a character reader in exclusion of that thing. And quite
Right.
often, we are not one or the other. It is about a balance between these things. What typically we don't want is something that is all narrative action, that it is just one thing after another, and it feels that they're just going through the motions, that there's no in-depth spending time with these characters. At the same time, a lot of literary fiction that focuses on the introspective nature of character and the human condition, not enough is happening. We want a balance between these things. And so when people say, oh, I'm a character reader, and they list all of these books, and I'm going, but there's an awful lot happening in those books that you don't want to read about Jaime Lannister sitting in his room ruminating on the nature of having lost a hand. Like,
right.
That's not but we enjoy spending time with these characters as they go through events. We like seeing the repercussions and ramifications of their actions and how it plays out. We get enjoyment out of that. So we enjoy aspects of character. But and again, it's about this oversimplification, this over reductionist sort of perspective to say it is a binary. And it's not either or. It's an entire spectrum between these points, because I think, and this is a personal preference, some of the greatest narratives are ones where there is a balance and supportive network of all of these different elements, where there are significant narrative events that are experienced by interesting characters that have complex drives and emotions, and some have development and arcs, while others are illustrative of symbolic aspects. And it is placed in an engaging and interesting setting that when all of it comes together like that, and then is relayed to us, narrated to us in a fascinating and engaging style, if everything works together, those to me are the most powerful narratives.
Yeah, great example of all that coming together that just came to my head is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where you have a character who is both the protagonist and the antagonist. And you have, of course, you could say that this is a split character in a sense as well, but in multiple senses of the word, because Dr. Jekyll, you could say, is the protagonist, but he's also his own antagonist, not just Mr. Hyde, but his own ambition, perhaps you could say, is what brings him to the point where he becomes Mr. Hyde. And you have a character that so much is wrapped around that dynamic, really. What do you want to say?
And one of the fascinating things with Jekyll and Hyde, because I've taught it, and the students are so quick to say Jekyll is good, Hyde is bad. Right?
No,
Jekyll
no,
is good,
no.
Hyde is
Yeah.
evil. And you're like, why is Hyde evil? Jekyll is afraid of damaging his public reputation.
Yeah.
So he creates a way to have his cake and eat it too. That people
Right.
think he is publicly respectable while he gets to do all of the things that the public would maybe not approve of.
Yeah.
And Hyde is not necessarily the embodiment of the id, but Hyde is engaged in a lot more of the sensuous, alive,
Right.
uh, and from the perspective of the narrative when it was written, animalistic qualities.
The
He
parts of
likes,
Jekyll that he suppresses most of the time in polite society, let's say. Yeah.
and but we see that tension in so many of the other characters in the novel as well, or novella,
Yeah.
sorry, I should say. We
Yeah.
see that tension in their characters. It is just exaggerated and used as this very clear symbolic investigation with splitting Jekyll and Hyde into these
Yeah.
two different facets that
Highly
war.
symbolic. Yeah.
It's a great novella, and if you read it just on that literal surface level, and there's no harm in doing that, I'm not criticizing that,
Right.
but if we just read on that surface level, we miss out on a lot of the nuance, complexity, and depth of what the story, what this narrative is actually dealing with, what it is investigating. And those concepts apply so frighteningly well to today.
Yes, indeed.
Um,
Yeah.
it it was actually quite a surprise. A lot of my students last year when they were, or earlier this year when they were studying it, were surprised that something written in the 19th century could be as relevant to social commentary today.
Yeah.
And it was very gratifying at the end of the class for them to have understood all of that, because they started to engage with it beyond oh well, he takes a magic potion and turns into a monster.
Yeah. In many ways, Dr. Jekyll is monstrous,
But
Yeah.
we see the same thing with Frankenstein. How many people
Yes.
refer to the monster as
The
Frankenstein?
created being, not the creator, and it's really the creator's ambition that is monstrous, and rather than the quote unquote monster who is actually a pretty philosophical dude.
And again, like it is a fascinating story, and I love the complexity that we can draw from it. You don't have to, but it is one of those things that as soon as you start thinking about it and you move beyond the literal surface, this is the thing that happened, and think about what that means in terms of broader conceptual understanding.
Yep. All right.
We start seeing it map onto very modern concerns, and it it's what keeps drawing me back to literature. That I love this stuff because there is room for a lot of individual interpretation within the bounds of what the text is communicating, and
Right.
that can be fascinating. But I think we've pretty much covered character.
I think we've done all right for a couple of characters. So thank you,
Well,
AP.
Philip, thank you very much for joining me. And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and we will see you in the next one.